Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host Vikas Swarup. In this week's episode, we will take you to a very important and close neighbor of India with which we share historical, cultural, and civilizational ties. This is a mountainous, landlocked country at the crossroads of Central and South Asia with a population of 40 million people and a median age of just 18.4 years. This is also a country where less than 3 months ago, a political earthquake took place when an insurgent group seized power in a lightning advance and the elected government collapsed. I'm talking about Afghanistan, of course, where the Taliban have come back to power after 20 years. During these 20 years, India played an important role in the nation-building process in Afghanistan, providing aid for humanitarian and infrastructure projects and becoming one of its biggest developmental partners. From constructing highways to transporting food, India invested time, money, and effort into rebuilding Afghanistan. Total Indian assistance to Afghanistan over the last 2 decades totaled more than $3 billion and was reflected in more than 500 projects scattered across all 34 provinces of Afghanistan. These included high-profile projects like the building of the Afghanistan Parliament at a cost of over $90 million, the 42-megawatt Salma Dam in Herat province, the $150 million Zaranj-Delaram highway stretching for 218 kilometers in southwestern Afghanistan, and the establishment of an electricity transmission line from Pule-Khumri to Kabul. India also invested heavily in Afghanistan's social infrastructure, committing $120 million for projects dealing with health, education, and community development. From building Sulabh toilets and a state-of-the-art medical diagnostic center in Kabul to helping coach the Afghan cricket team and constructing cricket stadiums in Kandahar and Mazar-e-Sharif, the Indian imprint can be clearly seen across the landscape of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is also geostrategically important to India because of its linkage to Central Asia, Iran, China, and Pakistan. India has been involved in projects of connectivity to Afghanistan and Central Asia, including the Chabahar Port project in Iran and the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan-India gas pipeline. India, therefore, needs a secure and stable Afghanistan. For this reason, as chair of the United Nations Security Council in August this year, India piloted Security Council Resolution 2593, which spelled out the 4 key demands of the international community from the Taliban. 1. That the territory of Afghanistan must not be used for terrorism or attack on any other country. 2. That the Taliban should facilitate safe passage for people wanting to leave Afghanistan. 3. That they should allow humanitarian access and uphold human rights, including for women and children. And 4. That they should strive for an inclusive and negotiated political settlement to end the conflict in the country. On the 10th of November, India went a step further and convened the Delhi Regional Security Dialogue on Afghanistan at the level of national security advisors. The aim of the conference was to seek a common understanding of how to approach the Taliban regime and how to deal with the triple threat to security emanating from developments there: an uptick in terror groups operating within Afghanistan, an increase in drug trafficking, and an inflow of refugees due to the humanitarian crisis unfolding there. The conference, which was hosted by Shri Ajit Doval, India's National Security Advisor, was attended by the top security officials from Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. To discuss this important meeting and what the future holds for Afghanistan, I'm joined by two guests who have intimate knowledge of that country. Ambassador Amar Sinha is a veteran of the Indian Foreign Service who served as India's ambassador to Tajikistan and as Secretary Economic Relations in the Ministry of External Affairs. Between 2013 and 2016, he was India's ambassador to Afghanistan. Dr. Omar Sharifi is a medical doctor who helped establish the Afghan Foundation for Culture and Civil Society. He got his PhD in social anthropology from Boston University and is currently working as assistant professor at the American University of Afghanistan, as well as being director of the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies in Kabul. Let me begin with you, Dr. Sharifi. Nearly 3 months after the capture of Kabul, no country has yet recognized the Taliban government. What is the reason for this? And how do you assess the political and humanitarian situation in your country?
Thank you very much for having me in this program. I mean, the question of why people do not recognize or why the world does not recognize Taliban is actually kind of points to this very fact that are we dealing with a militant group or are we dealing with a political entity? So far, what we're seeing from the way the Taliban, for instance, the way the peace process collapsed, the way the Taliban and different groups within the Taliban operated, and then this plethora of all this other jihadist groups that actually are worked with the Taliban or still are cooperating with Taliban, that actually shows very little that Taliban are actually building a state. We're dealing with a regime that is, in a way, hasn't made that major transition from being a kind of a militant into a political group. We see that in terms of the Taliban appointments, in terms of the Taliban now takeover of the state and the institutions and the stuff, and the collapse of the system. So I wonder why there is, I don't see much in to kind of see why they should be recognized. Because at least for the world, at least for the neighboring countries, especially India or Central Asia or anybody else, it's actually important to see that there is a state running in Afghanistan, not a group. And what we're seeing right now is quite not a state. But what is a humanitarian situation? Obviously, the Taliban coming and taking over Afghanistan, what we've seen in that period, obviously a collapse of institutions. But that collapse of institutions is not because simply the Taliban didn't want it to collapse. We saw a massive exodus of Afghans, professionals who just did not want to serve that state. Because in the minds of a lot of Afghans, when they see the Taliban, they remember the killings. They remember the bombings. They remember the suicide attacks. They remember the groups. They remember the women's rights being violated. They remember the schools being closed. So a lot of people actually did not want to work for them. And then the Taliban did not show Taliban and their patrons did not show a single inclination to actually want to run a state. They simply kind of distributed the spoils after the fall of Kabul and running it. So despite some efforts by, for instance, by Pakistan or some other countries trying to kind of show that Taliban is trying to build a state, and I believe maybe certain elements within the Taliban want to do that, kind of think of themselves as building in a state. There are absolutely no evidence to show that we are seeing a transition from a militant organization to a political entity.
Ambassador Sinha, the Indian side has so far met the Taliban in Doha and in Moscow. What have been the Taliban requests to India, and how should India deal with the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan?
See, Taliban's request first has been based on their appreciation of India's very positive role. That they have taken note of, that what we did was that we really selflessly helped Afghanistan, did not play politics, did not choose winners. So they have welcomed that role and they want us to continue. Obviously, they would want recognition from India as a regional country. That is where the problem is, because it is not only a change of government, as you said, this is an outcome. This government is not an outcome of the transition that was enshrined in the Doha Agreement. They have short-circuited that intra-Afghan process and are now suddenly seeking international recognition. And that is where I think they will meet some disappointment because there are delays. Eventually, they have a problem of legitimacy which is internal. It has nothing to do with outsiders. And international recognition will follow internal legitimacy, and that is reflected in every document, including what was issued yesterday, that it has to be inclusive. So Taliban has a problem. While it has sort of presented a dilemma to every country in the world, but they also have a dilemma, that how do they gain legitimacy without going through a peace process, without making an inclusive process and just grabbing power and then expecting that I'll put a gun to my own head or to the head of the 40 million people and demand that if you don't help me, these will suffer. And that is what you are seeing now. They are issuing these threats. So we will have to really see whether the government in Kabul is independent, is sovereign, has the ability to govern, is inclusive. And those are the things we should guide, because ultimately India's policy, what you said, what we have done is really invested in the human resources, which you are seeing today that they're either getting killed or most have left. So it's a huge flight. And that has further debilitated the state. So we will have to see how their policies towards the people are and how independent and sovereign they are. And only then it will be recognized an Afghan government. Otherwise, it will be difficult to recognize a proxy government, if I can put it mildly.
Dr. Sharifi, India earned a lot of goodwill in Afghanistan with its developmental footprint and its soft power. Can you share with us, how does the ordinary Afghan view India?
Well, when we think of Afghanistan and India in a kind of, not just in context of what happens in 20 years, we're going to put it in the larger context of what India sort of like, how India was imagined in the minds of many Afghans. First, it was obviously very cultural. Culture in the sense that a lot of what we today call, though, at least in the city that I grew up, Kabul, though we are Persian speakers, but culturally and stuff, we all see themselves more connected to the North Indian traditions rather than that of Central Asia or Iran or something else. But in terms of how the Afghans sees that, when we looked at, because when the Taliban fell in 2001, they completely and systematically destroyed the state apparatus in that time. So when the international community came to Afghanistan in 2001, we did not know what to do. We did not know that our ministries were gone, our archives were gone, our systems were destroyed and stuff. So India played probably, in my opinion, the most important role in training a large group of Afghans who took, in a way, connected them with the modern world. So in the minds of a lot of us, we see India as something that actually gave us the tools to talk, to think, and to imagine ourselves how to run a system. So in the minds of others, there is a lot of goodwill for India. And at the same time, though people say Afghanistan is a victim of India-Pakistan rivalry, but I haven't seen anything that kind of building a school can be equaled with blowing up a bridge or killing the doctors and things. So in my opinion, there's a lot of goodwill towards India.
Ambassador Sinha, India just hosted an NSA-level conference on Afghanistan, on regional security. What was the significance of this conference?
There are several significances. First, of course, I'm very happy that India took that initiative. India was being criticized for being in the back seat, etc. So started playing on the front foot, let's put it this way, because we have a story to tell. And I think it's very important that the world hears how we look at the Afghan situation. So I think the biggest significance was we took that lead, which we were very hesitant for some reason. Second, the participation. We had all the 5 Central Asian countries. We had Russia, we had Iran, Pakistan and China decided not to come. But that does not detract from the importance, because I believe that all those countries which are worried about the people in Afghanistan were there. Those countries which are looking at Afghanistan only through strategic lens or control of territory or the minerals that the territory contains, and they don't worry about the people, they did not come. So there's a very clear distinction. So I think such meetings are important, because it then starts differentiating between the policies that different countries are having towards Afghanistan. And I think there was a huge deal of consensus. That is why none of these countries, which at one point looked as if they are all on the verge of recognizing Taliban before they took over Kabul, have not taken that step. There's great convergence and concern on the threats, and the threats are multifold. One is, of course, the ideology itself of its spreading, terror groups which operate out of there, the drugs that flow out of Afghanistan, and that may become the only source for the Taliban government, immigration, and of course the huge amount of sophisticated weaponry which has fallen in the hands, which will not only be used by the fighters, but worst is this will have a long-term presence in the region, because this will all be manufactured once again, reverse engineered in the factories of the world, in Dara Adam Khel areas where rip-offs are made, and this is going to stay for a long time in the region. So I think this is a concern that's shared by all of us. And of course, I think my own sense is that there was a shared distrust in terms of Taliban, because Taliban has to gain credibility among the region that what it says, it will actually do.
Dr. Sharifi, as Ambassador Sinha said, Pakistan refused to attend this conference, claiming that India is playing the role of a spoiler in Afghanistan. But it appears that it is Pakistan which is playing the role of a spoiler, because first of all, it refused to attend the conference, it refused to accept our invitation, and secondly, it is refusing to respond to an Indian request to allow humanitarian aid and wheat and medicines to be supplied to Afghanistan from Wagah to Torkham, and assist people of Afghanistan who are in dire need. So how do you assess Pakistan's role in Afghanistan?
Thinking about Pakistan and how the Pakistanis kind of play the game. First, the idea of like not allowing humanitarian assistance to come to Afghanistan now, I think it's not new, because the same thing happens about, what, 18 years ago, 20 years ago, when Afghanistan was liberated and India wanted to provide some support, and then Pakistan did not allow the wheat and others to come. So that's, at the same time, I do not believe Pakistan actually look at Afghanistan as a sovereign state or a sovereign country. It's because, I mean, at least my understanding of dealing with the Pakistani elite and stuff through different channels, I think we're dealing with an ideological sort of an entity that looks kind of always see things in a black and white. And the way, in a way, they handled the Taliban, the way they presented the Taliban, the way they created all these groups which functions under the umbrella of the Taliban, I'm not sure that, in a way, to me, as with a first-hand experience of what the Pakistanis did to Afghanistan, is they still see Afghanistan as a place to take responsibilities out of them and then launch all these jihadi groups against their enemies. Now, when you look kind of thinking about like the Afghanistan, Taliban, and Pakistan sort of as a triangle and stuff, first, though Pakistan today somehow thinks about being in the leading role, but when we look at the Taliban themselves, and we always have to put it in the context of what the mujahideen groups were in the 1980s and early 90s, we're not dealing with a monolithic entity that is always the same. Certain elements when Pakistan actually supports the most horrific group, the Haqqani network, which is responsible for the most horrible kind of crimes that ever happened in the last 20 years in Afghanistan and other places. So Pakistan is close to the most radical entities within the Taliban, and even those Taliban who actually wanted to somehow try to normalize themselves, they are being sidelined by the Pakistanis. So in fact, when you put all the picture together, as an Afghan, when I look at my country right now, I see Afghanistan as an occupied country. And I don't think that will be an easy thing for Pakistan to handle, because one thing is actually proven again and again in history. When you don't learn, the Afghans don't like an entity, it will not last.
Strong words indeed from Dr. Sharifi.
I may just add to what he said, you know, that we should not look at Pakistan not coming to India or regional security dialogue as something unique. In fact, it has not attended the other two dialogues of similar nature which were held in Iran in 2018 and 2019. And this basically reflects their thinking that they feel that Afghanistan is their backyard and they need to control the entire process. And obviously they have a huge competition, a sense of competition with India, which is of course misplaced. But because of that, they want to see. And well, when he's, in fact, what Mr. Moeed Yusuf said, well, it's good that the spoiler did not come to the party. I, in fact, endorse his view that the main spoiler for Afghanistan did not attend, because it is, their objectives are different. We are looking at trying to stabilize and sort of normalize Afghanistan. They are trying to push the international community to recognize the government as it is, because that government today, unfortunately, while what we think we are talking of as a Taliban government, but essentially the levers of power are with the Haqqani network, which everybody knows are totally controlled by the ISI. And that is why if you see the moderate nationalist Taliban have all been sidelined, even in Kabul. So what you see today is Taliban is the big group, but the actual power lies directly with Haqqanis, and that's why on 6th of September, the ISI chief had to go there to mediate and perhaps even help midwife the new government.
Dr. Sharifi, the international community sought certain guarantees from the Taliban as reflected in the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2593. What are the chances of the Taliban actually adhering to those demands?
Well, the whole idea of like international community engaging with the Taliban and kind of trying to look at it as a government, at least my experience, or actually understanding the whole phenomenon of jihadist groups that has been active in Afghanistan and in the region for a while. We are not dealing with an entity that is actually for governing. We're dealing with an entity that's its only focus is on ruling and extracting in kind of resources and ruling things. So the whole idea of the recognition by the international community for the majority of the ideologically jihadists is actually irrelevant. Pakistan and some groups within Taliban really need that because they want to build something and for the Pakistan to legitimize it. But for the majority of these jihadist groups, this is a completely irrelevant. Even a few days ago, the whole idea of after the talks in Tehran, and then the Chinese ambassador visiting Kabul and stuff, there's a group of all these other several Taliban leaders gathered in Herat and wanted to continue the jihad in Xinjiang and also attack Iran. Despite the short answers the Taliban gave it some Sunni groups that's operating in Iranian borders or not. So we're actually dealing with a group that is ideological, that has actually have very little regard for the international rules and laws, and is about rule and control rather than govern. So when the international community wants Taliban to do this and that, that is being the continuation of this long misperception that you're dealing with an entity that has a political agenda. But we're dealing with an entity that at the core of it may act, may pretend to be political, but at the core of it is ideological. And that is the characteristic of what we've learned and what is making them different from the mujahideen, because we can say, oh, they were the same jihadists. The mujahideen leaders at least remembered Afghanistan before war. They had a connection with the history, with the culture of Afghanistan and the region, and a sense of sovereignty. We're dealing with a group and the leadership of a group that is completely, in a way, absorbed into international jihadism and believes like that, at least majority of them, or at least those who are in power right now and controls arms and have organic relationship with other groups in the region. So for the Taliban, the international community is not what's sitting in New York or another place through UN. As the jihadi networks have been supported them, helped them for all these years, and they believe will sustain them in the future.
Ambassador Sinha, you want to come in on this? How do we socialize the Taliban?
Well, it's tough. You see, I always feel the Taliban is going to collapse under the burden of expectations, both internal and external. Internal because people want peace and security and governance. You see, there will be none of that. There will be no economy. There's a humanitarian crisis tearing Afghanistan. External because we really believe, because the analysts have boxed these jihadi groups in under different labels, under different flags. But what he said is absolutely right. It doesn't believe in nation state. It believes in OMAR. It believes in spreading its message around the world through force. And that's not going to change, because once that changes, there no longer will be Taliban. And further right-wing groups will replace them. So that's a dilemma the Taliban faces. So the external expectation that they will reform, they will cut links with other terror groups, I don't think Taliban will succeed because it just cannot. So that's a wrong expectation. That's why I said this. You see, the entire belief that we are dealing with a normal government itself is putting us on a wrong policy path. And then their links with all the countries, and it's not only the neighboring countries, this is going to flow everywhere. In fact, it's very interesting, but that will go beyond the scope of this discussion. The start of this entire ideology and why things started going wrong in Afghanistan, but it started way back in '65. And a number of regional developments led to that growth. What we are seeing today is something where people are trying to believe that, this is a default mode for Afghanistan. The 20 years was an aberration of democratic experiment. Before that, there was Taliban. So today, when Americans are leaving, Taliban can come back and it's a normal government. I feel that Taliban regime then and now is an aberration, not the template for Afghanistan. And that is why this experiment, again, will be short-lived. We should engage them. We should do everything possible to change and modify them, because ultimately, if they can reintegrate, that's the best outcome. Otherwise, I think there are so many contradictions within that it's not going to last very long.
You're absolutely right, because an unstable Afghanistan will not only spell disaster for the Indian subcontinent, but for the world at large, because the AFPAC region could once again become the global nursery of international terrorism. So what can the international community do to ensure that there is no recurrence of what happened in 2001?
Well, it's tough. It's really tough. Of course, we should keep a very sharp eye. Of course, intelligence level and collection of intelligence has grown. We have already drawn up laws on which track every money that flows to terrorist organizations. So obviously the role of FATF is very, very important. Then I think the nations which support have to be made accountable. And under UN UN Charter, they have to be taken to task and held responsible for the activities. It cannot be business as usual, because this is going to destabilize the entire world, because you're dealing with an ideology which sees the rest of the world as enemy. Now it doesn't see as something that they can coexist with. So we have to play it sort of very deftly. So in my mind, it goes beyond diplomacy. It is more of a civilizational sort of a war. Of course, I know that people don't believe in civilizational war, but it's an ideological war, let's put it this way, and ideologies have to be dealt and weakened, perhaps as other ideologies before this got weakened, so that people can live a normal life. And you know, very interesting thing, while Pakistan today is gloating that it has achieved something, but if you see the developments of the last week, I see that it is the tail now wagging the dog, where Interior Minister of Afghanistan is actually helping negotiate peace with terror groups which are affecting Pakistan. So you see, story is going to change very dramatically, because Haqqani also inhabit the AFPAC area where the other terror groups which affect Pakistan reside. They are not going to cut links that easily. So let's see who gets the strategic depth in the end.
What is your take on this, Dr. Sharifi? Can the international community really work on the Taliban government to ensure at least that international terrorism does not once again become a phenomenon?
I mean, we need to define what is international community. The consensus on Afghanistan, or even at what is a terror group collapse, that first step toward kind of how to deal with the Taliban is the people or the countries or the international community at large needs to actually come to a term with itself. We need a level of consensus right now, because the lack of the consensus, lack of an understanding of what is the danger, led to the kind of victory for Al-Qaeda, for Taliban, for ISIS, for everything. So for now for these things, and I think India can play an absolutely crucial role in terms of like putting itself as a vanguard of trying to build a consensus. That is to me crucial, but because I'm not very worried about the Taliban changing, because Taliban are Taliban. And you can't change them much. I mean, they will show it to the world soon, as much as now they cut a lot of like sort of way to talk, to find out the facts. But I think for now we need a consensus within the region and larger region and with the world to actually figure out what's going on. Then the next step will come.
Then final question for you. As an Afghan, how do you see the future of your country?
We're going through a very dark period. We're going through a period in which a lot of things that we built around in the threat of collapse. But at the same time, it's not the first time I personally even seeing it, from 92, 96, and 2001 and stuff, that I personally witnessed. But at the same time, I know that we're dealing with a phenomenon, at least in Afghanistan, that is unnatural for us. Nowhere in the course of Afghanistan history will run by a clerical regime. So I hope that we will get out of it. But I do not believe we will get out of it alone by ourselves. So it will be in kind of a joint effort, but I believe there is a way.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharifi and Ambassador Sinha. It is clear from your comments that Afghanistan's real hope for a safe, secure, and sustainable future lies in the Taliban honoring their commitments on human rights and political pluralism, which was also the message of the New Delhi conference, which was held recently. That is all I have for you tonight. Join me again next week for a new episode of Diplomatic Dispatch. Till then, good evening and goodbye.